I'd like to thank Yeshiva University, Professor Cohn for inviting me, and I'm especially pleased to be part of the China-Jewish conversation. The two traditions are really extremely comparable and yet little comparative. Textual studies, comparative history has been done on them, and I think he has noted now for a number of years that there is a very rich set of materials in both traditions by which we can understand each tradition better and both traditions against each other. So I'm really happy to be part of the conversation, and I'm again delighted to be here, and thank you for the warm welcome.
Professor Gardner, as everyone knows by now, wrote a book called Environmental Pollution in China, What Everybody Needs to Know. So what I want to know, first thing I want to know is, China's been very seriously polluted for 3 decades now. And you talk a lot in your book about the concept of new environmentalism in recent years. Why do you think there's been a paradigm shift, and what changed?
Yeah, let's rewind the tape here to 1980, just to sort of set the stage a bit. In 1976, Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Communist Party, dies. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping becomes the paramount leader. Deng Xiaoping reverses some of Mao's most fundamental policies, collectivizing agriculture, collectivizing industry. And what Deng says is we need, in a sense, to liberalize the economy. How are we going to do that? Well, by reforming the marketplace. And what he meant by that is we're going to decollectivize and privatize, not the whole economy, but at least have a partial privatization of industry, agriculture, and the like. This skyrocketed the economy. That is to say, from 1980 until 2010, we have an economy that grew at the average annual increase in GDP was roughly 10%. I mean, think about that. I mean, the rest of the world averaged under 5%. And so China was really the envy, which is why, of course, everyone dubbed it the Chinese miracle. In this brief time, China in 1980 was the 10th largest economy in the world, and it's now the 2nd largest economy. Now, another boost to this economy came in 2001, and this is necessary to sort of understand where we're going environmentally. President Bill Clinton argued, let's let China become members of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. This is in 2001. There was a lot of resistance to that. People didn't want China, it's a communist country, in the WTO. Bill Clinton said, its economy is so vital to the globe, we really need to admit China.
So in fact, it's actually the economy stupid.
Yeah, it was very much about the economy, and it really, what happens now is that the global trade takes off because China's such a powerhouse, but China becomes what people call the workshop of the world. That is, it starts manufacturing and exporting to the rest of the world, so that its economy continues to skyrocket. Now China is the world's largest exporter. We know the downside of all this, though. The downside is, how do you power an economy? Well, you power the Chinese economy with fossil fuels. You power the Chinese economy especially with coal. Coal's abundant, coal's inexpensive. So the economic miracle of the last 30 and 40 years has done wonders for the prosperity, obviously, of the country. But it has also brought pollution to China again, the state is critical of pollution. Now, what I want to say here, though, is that in the first part of the 21st century, there were Chinese environmental theorists who sort of woke up and said, we've got a problem here. Sure, our economy is doing fabulously well, but we can't sustain the economy without destroying the environment, without exhausting our natural resources.
But at that point, the government said, well, we're polluting now, but we're going to clean it up.
Right. At that point, there was at least more interest. They started doing that. You had, again, one of my heroes. So I'll put in a plug for him. His name is Pan Yue. And Pan Yue was the vice minister of the Ministry of Environmental Protection, as it was called then. And he said, look, we can't sustain this economy at this level without destroying the planet. And so he started arguing that what we need to do, we need to sort of move to a different sort of environmental awareness, what he started calling ecological civilization. And this was in the first decade, the first half decade of the 21st century. To be brief, or to try to be a little briefer, President Hu Jintao, president then of China, picks up on this and he starts mouthing, oh yes, we need to clean up the environment, but doesn't go very far with it. But in 2012, the Chinese Communist Party puts an amendment in the party constitution saying our pledge is to build this ecological civilization. And what it meant was we need to find a harmony between humanity and the environment. We have to move away from what has been our modernization model, pollute first and clean up later. And that pollution model, or that modernization model, is a model that's been embraced by most developing and developed countries. It's what you do. You move the economy along, you industrialize to modernize, you build the economy, and then you step back and you try to remediate the environment. And so China isn't alone in pursuing that sort of model, but in the early years of the 21st century says time to change it. Then in 2012, when it becomes an amendment in the party constitution, Xi Jinping accedes to power. He becomes the chair of the party in December of 2012, and in March of 2013, he becomes the president. He totally embraces this notion we must build an ecological civilization.
So one common argument you used to hear from the Chinese a lot is, well, this is our industrial revolution. You know, the US and the UK and Europe had their industrial revolution 200 years ago, but now this is our turn. It's our turn to pollute. Now, Xi sort of moves away from that. And what would you say are his motivations? And why did he feel entitled or empowered to do that?
I think there were a lot of motivating factors for Xi Jinping. Let me focus on three, rather, as they say, each somewhat briefly. First, in the first year of his presidency, there are a number of highly visible, what you could call environmental events. That's number one. In the same year, in 2013, we see advances in science that are going to make aware some of the effects of pollution, especially on health. And number three is the growing costs of environmental pollution in 2013. So let me back up and explain each of those, because this is important in understanding why Xi has moved ahead. Why?
Sorry, just can we? Was anyone in China in 2013? Can we? Anyone? One. 2012. 2012. Okay, I was just out of interest.
Yeah. Well, 2013 was in January. The mother of all smogs settled in over North China. I mean, nasty smog. A smog that was dubbed by foreigners, it's stuck even in China, called the apocalypse. Very famous. It's settled in. The quality of air, let me just, abbreviate this. The quality of air in Beijing in the month of January was worse than the quality of air in the average airport smoking lounge in the United States.
Well,
now remember, you choose to smoke in the smoking lounge. You don't choose to breathe the air in Beijing if you're a resident or a citizen.
So I lived in Beijing during Airpocalypse in 2013, and there was a joke going around on the Chinese internet saying, how do we make the air cleaner in Beijing? Well, it's cleaner through a cigarette with a filter.
The social media had a field day with this. So that happens in January, and we can talk about the apocalypse because it's a big event. It's constantly referred to today, and it's had an indelible effect on the Chinese people. Second was just a few months later, in the Huangpu River. That's the river that flows right by Shanghai. It's the major source of drinking water in Shanghai. Well, in March of 2013, right after the apocalypse hits Beijing, 16,000 pig carcasses flow down the Huangpu River right by Shanghai, which, as I say, is the major source of the drinking water. The third, just a few months later, the officials did a survey in Guangzhou province, in Guangzhou, a very affluent city, a major city in South China. What they found was, of all the samples of rice that they took, 44% of the samples were heavily laced with the heavy metal cadmium. Now, cadmium promotes cancer, cardiovascular problems, respiratory diseases, renal problems. So now the Chinese people find that their daily staple is killing them. So we have those three events. Moving on to science. This becomes really important. I mean, we assume that there's sort of a science associated with the environment that's been around forever and ever. And with health, the effects on health. And the fact is, the environmental health field's a very new field. So in 2013, same time, and remember, this is when Xi is assuming power. I think that timing is really important. So there's a study that's done, it's called the Global Burden of Disease Study. And what it found, it studied the whole world and what the burden of disease around the whole globe is. And what this study found was in the year 2010, again, the study was 2013, but in 2010, 1.2 million Chinese died prematurely just from breathing the air. So imagine you're Chinese, you've lived in Beijing, you've gotten quite used to the cough, you live in Shanghai, you live in Harbin, you live in North China. You've gotten used to the cough, and you're willing to tolerate the cough. Why? Economy's going up. You're benefiting.
You're concerned about buying that new car. You're concerned about other things. The cough is annoying, but at that point, people didn't think the cough killed them.
Right, exactly right. So now they find out, okay, this cough isn't just a nuisance. It's not that it tastes slightly, acidic. It's that it too is killing me. And then a few months later, really important. I mean, for those who are interested in science, I love this study. It was a study, the Huai River runs through, it pretty much divides North China from South China. And from 1980 to 2000, and actually beyond, the government used to supply people in North China with coal for free on the grounds that it was needed there to provide heating during the winter. Okay, so what this study discovered this Huai River study, is that people living in the north of China, they were subjected to 55% greater pollution, what's called particulate matter. The real point of this study was, as a result, now imagine you're Chinese, you live in the north. You have relatives and friends who live in the south. What you've discovered now with this study is you are living 5.5 fewer years. That's your life expectancy. Just because you live in the north of China where coal is more generously burnt. So you have those scientific studies. Now, what else do you have that she's responding to? Well, she's responding, one, to the costs, right? The cost of public health, high, very high. The cost of GDP. Now, GDP costs are hard to nail down because they all use different metrics. But I've seen anywhere between 3% and 15% of the GDP. And it was growing at that point. Well, that basically is wiping out the increase, the annual increase in GDP. So that becomes motivation for Xi to do something. But there are other factors. You as tourists, it's like now. You say, I'm not going to China. And Beijing, the tourism went way down. Tourism affected the economy. Why? We all saw pictures of the smog in Beijing. And so we stopped going. And they lost 10% of their tourism. So that was an issue. Wealthy people.
Also, Beijing taxi drivers are famously rude. I think that's off-putting for a lot of tourists.
Wealthy people in China would tell the Hurun survey that, and when I say wealthy people, people making over 1.5 million or American dollars, or who had $1.5 million in assets, 64% of people making $1.5 million or assets of $5 million told the Hurun survey they either were planning to leave or had made plans to leave China. Now, I don't take those at face value. And the reason being the environment. That was the reason they gave. Now, that's where I'm not sure we can take that at face value, but that's what they say. China doesn't want to lose that revenue. Last, what's the cost? What's really the cost? Protests. People taken to the streets. People taken to the streets, sometimes in numbers as large as 10,000, to complain about pollution in the air or paraxylene chemical plants that are known to pollute the water and to cause cancer in those who drink the water. So these are, I think, real strong motivations for Xi Jinping to move. And I think he really wants to address pollution in self-interest.
So, well, where Xi Jinping's concerned, actually, there's an interesting point about protests. In 2007, I don't know if anybody remembers this, they had a scandal with Chinese-made infant formula that was giving babies kidney stones. And in the years following 2007, you see a massive influx of Chinese people immigrating to Canada, Australia, Great Britain. And I think he sort of learned his lesson from that. That scared him. That scared that administration.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but I actually wanted to talk about something Dr. Cohen mentioned in terms of the Shemitah, and the idea that the current administration is promoting what's called an ecological society and using Confucianism as a PR line. Did Confucius say it? Did Confucius mean it? Can Confucius be argued to have said it?
Yeah, it's really a very good question. I mentioned how in the early years of 2000, some of these environmental theorists came along and said, and they used your term, they said, here's the problem. We're living now in an industrial civilization stage, and suggesting that we basically in China have been mimicking the West. It doesn't work. It can't be sustained. And so they started arguing. By the way, this has traction outside of China as well. But we need to move, and this is what these theorists argue and continue to argue today, but they began, especially with Pan Yue, the vice minister, they began saying, we've got to move to a new stage of human development. We've got to get out of this industrial civilization state because it simply isn't sustainable. We are exhausting all of the planet's resources. And so what people like Pan Yue then started arguing is that, if we're going to do this globally, China is unique in having a civilization and having a tradition to draw on, a tradition that can sort of guide the whole world in the 21st century into this new stage of human development. I mean, what he was arguing is that China's exceptional here. We can do this because of our deep cultural resources. Other countries cannot do this.
We are the chosen people. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
So if we look, I mean, Professor Cohn put these together. When he asked me to speak, he asked, well, what sources do Chinese environmentalists draw on? And so I gave him a bunch of sources, and lo and behold, he put them together so that we can refer to some. But I think it is worth looking at Pan Yue's statement. Pan Yue at the very bottom of the page, and there is no Chinese version of this. One of the core principles of traditional Chinese culture, and this is picked up on, Xi Jinping says this. He mimics this. He says it's our culture that sort of gives us a head start here. It's our culture that's going to enable us to move to this new sort of civilization. I mean, he himself is looking to the past. So you have this irony, this, head of the Chinese Communist Party saying, we have got to return to some of our fundamental cultural values as they're embodied in the Confucian tradition especially, but also the Taoist tradition. Different philosophies all emphasize the political wisdom of a balanced environment. Again, I don't know that this is true. We can talk about this, but this is what he posits. Whether it is the Confucian idea of humans and nature becoming one, the Taoist view of the Tao reflecting nature, or the Buddhist belief that all living things are equal, Chinese philosophy has helped our culture to survive for thousands of years. It can be a powerful weapon in preventing an environmental crisis and building a harmonious society. Well, why would they want the Chinese environmentalists, Xi Jinping, to point to the past? And here it's challenging sorting out the motives and deciding which has greatest currency. But I think one is that there's genuinely a belief that they have an ecological foundation that's 3,000 years old, and that the texts speak to that, and that they can draw on that today in formulating a new sort of civilization. I think that's possibility one. Possibility two is legitimacy. What Xi Jinping is trying to do, and the environmentalists, is convincing the people we've got to move toward ecological equilibrium.
Could you take it one step further and even say he's promoting the sense of national pride? This is who we are. This is who we are as a people. It's within us.
That's the third, and I would separate that and saying part of it is nationalistic too, because this instills pride. This says we can do this when others can't. Now remember, part of this ecological civilization, and I'm sure Elena will get to this, is it means perhaps curbing economic growth. If you're going to stop pollution and enforce regulations, well, then you want the Chinese people to feel for a reason. You want them to feel the sacrifice is worth making. And how are they going to feel that? Well, okay, we're exceptional. We can do this. If we can do this, we can make for a new world. So So I think that there are various reasons that might do that. But let's look at just a passage or two that they commonly refer to. The first one, number one, this is a commonly used in Confucian texts, and environmentalists, again, proverbially refer to it. Heaven and humankind are one. Kenren He. Number three, this is from an equally strong tradition in China, the Taoist tradition. Man models himself on earth, earth on heaven, heaven on the way, and the way on that which is naturally so.
So
And then one more, number five. Okay, number five is one everyone likes to point to. Heaven is my father. This is from the 11th century. Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds an intimate place in their midst. Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I consider as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. So these are texts that they constantly make mention of, among others. And you can decide for yourself. I mean, I know Elaine wants to make a comment, so you should jump in here.
Well, my understanding of this and my understanding of heaven as a concept is very interesting because there's some parallels we can draw on with Chinese, classical Chinese texts and classical Jewish ones. Heaven, in this case, in classical Chinese, there's no anthropomorphical God. Heaven is, when they say heaven, they in fact are referring to God. So if we go through 1, 3, and 5 again, 3 and 5 especially, it says, man models himself on earth and earth on heaven. So God, we can draw the parallel. It says, we're in the Bible, where it says God created man in his image. And in 5, it says, heaven is my father, earth is my mother. At least in the Christian faith, but I'm sure in my limited understanding of Jewish classical texts as well, it says that God is my father. And in the classical Chinese understanding, we don't, again, there's no anthropomorphical God, but heaven, when we refer to heaven or the sky, even, it means God. Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, you're getting into a very big question here, obviously, because as you point out, the Chinese really never embraced the idea of a monotheistic deity, and so that when we look at heaven and the term heaven in the Chinese tradition, we always have to ask, what is meant by the author. And I think what we see here, at the very least, is a much more holistic, I'm not sure we want to call it ecological, but a much more holistic view of the universe, where you have heaven, earth, and humankind, always as a triad. And they talk about, in the earliest texts, and here's where I think the environmentalists can make a point, they talk about something that I suspect, and here I would have to lean on my colleagues in Jewish studies, they talk about, it's a term ganying, mutual reciprocity, that it's not just that heaven, nature, earth can stimulate, affect, influence humanity. Humanity does the same. Humanity can, in fact, stimulate or influence heaven or the ways of nature. And this is something that they've expressed for 3 millennia now. Now, again, does that make it Confucianism ecological? I'll very briefly give you my sense of it. I'm totally confused. I can argue it either way, but I have problems saying that Confucianism really forms a good ecological foundation. I have less of a problem saying it can serve as a source of inspiration to a new ecology today, if the Chinese want to draw up a new ecology. The problem I have with it is that these are selections, and in fact, what Confucianism primarily says is it's the ruler's responsibility to care for the people. And what does the ruler, what does that mean? It's the ruler's responsibility to care for the material well-being of the people. What does that mean? The agriculture. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the government was responsible for deforestation, for cutting down trees to make room for agriculture, and that it was responsible for damming rivers to control flooding. Well, we know now much better that damming rivers has its ecological or environmental problems. So the question really is, was Confucianism, ecologically sensitive? I'm not terribly sure of that. Might it be used? Absolutely. The way any religious tradition can be drawn on, and has to be drawn on if it's going to be kept alive. I mean, if Xi Jinping and others want the Confucian tradition, if they want to revitalize it, they have to demonstrate how it's relevant to people today. And so there's a lot going on here when it comes to the environmentalists sort of looking to the past, President Xi Jinping looking to the past. What's his motive? And that's a fascinating question.
Well, I mean, what President Xi is very good at doing is harnessing the power of the classics as PR, right? But here in the West, I think we have this way of thought that says the economy or the environment, but you can't have both.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the main challenge that Chinese faces. I mean, when people say to me, where we headed in the 21st century with China, I'm not a political scientist, so don't pretend to be an expert on anything, other than perhaps a bit of the environment. But the real challenge that China faces in the 21st century is how do you address the tension between economic prosperity and environmental stewardship?
And sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, this ties kind of into my next question, which is, I'm sorry for cutting you off right there, but in terms of Chinese environmental regulations, the Chinese have it's one of the most heavily regulated environmental systems in the world. Why is it not working?
Yeah. Those two questions are closely interrelated. I'll answer the second first, and then if we have time, we can go back to the first. But it's a good question, and I think we first have to disabuse ourselves of a misunderstanding that most of us in the West, most people outside of China have, and that is that China is monolithic. It is not monolithic. I mean, by monolithic, I mean there is this notion, Xi Jinping lays down the rule in Beijing, and all the other high officials.
It's not like everyone else, 1.4 billion people automatically downloaded and now subscribe to it as well.
Right. But it's not just the people, it's even the higher officials. There are camps. There's disagreement. There are those today who want to put more emphasis, for example, on environment, while there are others who say we've got to keep our economic growth moving along, and we can't do anything to compromise it. And then you have the national level, the local officials. So you have, at the central level, different ministries with different priorities. And we have to keep that in mind. The Ministry of Ecology and Environment is one of 27 ministries. It's the weakest ministry. It's the least well-funded. The MEE, think about this, has 300 employees. As serious as they are about the environment, 300 employees. The EPA has 15,000 employees. So again, it's underfunded, understaffed, and then it comes up against these very powerful ministries.
Right.
Ministry of
The
Finance.
Department of Agriculture says we are going to cut down this forest, and
Right,
how does
exactly.
how does the MEE compete against the Department of
Exactly.
Agriculture?
That's a wonderful example. I mean, where you have, again, the agricultural minister said, we have to do this. They're likely to trump MEE just because they've been more powerful and they just have more stature. So that's an issue, but also the local officials. Local officials have very different interests from the national officials. National officials, they've sort of reached an agreement. We got to find this balance, this eco-civilization bit. They're pretty much all in on that. I mean, what balance they might strike among, or individually is a matter of interest. But again, they've generally agreed. The local officials, they're not motivated the same way. What do the local officials want? They want the industries in their area to do well. They care about that. Why? Because they need that revenue.
So the way local officials are assessed, can we just talk about that for 1 minute? So
yeah, go ahead.
It's a cadre system where they are, imagine like March Madness, like you're making power brackets. They compete they compete against each other, essentially, and they're scored. And everyone, their main priority for any local official is, how do I beat the guy in the town next to me?
Yeah, no, that's right. So, so they want to promote these industries because it's good for revenue, good for taxes, their local populace has jobs, and so if those industries are polluting, they've tended to close their eyes to it. And then Elena's point's really important. So on top of that sort of self-interest, their performance is assessed by the national government. If I get promoted and I'm a municipal official, I'll get promoted. Why? Well, I'll get promoted because I have grown the GDP. That's why I get promoted. Now, the Chinese government, since 2010, has been promising we're going to recalibrate that system, and we're going to introduce environmental performance. And we're going to make that a criterion.
And how is that assessed locally?
Yeah, and we're going to balance that. But 2010, they started talking about that. They're still talking about that. Local officials don't believe that that's the way to be promoted. They still believe the way to be promoted is to grow the GDP, which means that they're going to close their eyes to local pollution if those industries are profiting the local area. So there are all sorts of problems here. Also, fines and punishments have been minimal for environmental violations. And environmentalists will tell you it's much cheaper to violate, pay the fine, and go on, rather than to...
There are no real consequences to polluting.
Right.
You pay your fine. For example, when you get pulled over for speeding, right? What's the first thing they make you do? They make you sit in a car for 20 minutes and wait to teach you the fact that you don't get anything by speeding. If they just made you pay a fine, I think more people would speed. They would say you didn't. They want to get it in your head that you didn't save any time.
Yeah. So the point being that they're really, that they have probably, some people argue, more environmental regulations than any place in the world. And the reason that's important to point out is this, from my point of view. The attitude toward China is that China doesn't care about the environment. And that's something I would take exception to. China may not be addressing its environmental problems as successfully, as quickly as it might like, but given their policies, where they shuttering coal mines, they've put $1 trillion into cleaning up water, air, and soil pollution, where they are the world's largest investor in renewable energy development by far. So that this year, 2019, they invested $88 billion. The second biggest investor in the world was the U.S. at $54 billion. So again, they are going all in on renewables. They are the largest manufacturer and market for
Electric vehicles.
Solar panels, largest manufacturer and consumer of solar panels, largest manufacturer and consumer, again, by far, of wind turbines. And this is a problem. This is a problem because what the U.S. is doing is stepping back and saying, oh, look at China's pollution, and ignoring the progress that China is making. Now, China is going all in on this, not just because it's wants to clean up the environment, wants to deal with popular dissatisfaction, though that's important, and it's costing the economy. It's also going all in because it knows that the economy of tomorrow is clean energy and green technology. Stephen Chu, who, Chinese American, was the Secretary of Energy in 2010. 2010, he goes before Congress, which was then a Republican Congress, and he says, this is a loose paraphrase, but he says, look, you people, you might not care about pollution, and so you might not care about competing with, the Chinese and cleaning up the environment, but it's about the economy, stupid. That's really was his point, that if we in the U.S. don't start developing clean energy, green technology, in 2050, we will be in the hole, in a big hole. And so if we want to maintain, never mind our environmental leadership, our leadership on climate change, if we want to maintain our economic leadership, we in the U.S. had better sort of move things along quickly, because right now they're focused, the Chinese. And I don't say that we should do this just to compete, because we need to do this environmentally as well. But for those who are more cynical and say, oh, Chinese aren't doing anything, they should wake up and start, again, thinking about the economy.
But so how do we then depoliticize the environment here in the U.S.? Uh-oh. That's not a good
very
question.
hard to do, I think. I can only tell you sort of where I'm at on this one.
Where do you think our administration is at versus the Chinese one? Do you think it could be because Donald Trump, let's say he gets reelected, I won't get, but let's hypothesize in a different parallel universe, he gets reelected. He's in office for 4 years and then he's done, right? Xi Jinping is going to be in office until he dies.
Yeah.
Do you think that plays a role in it?
Well, I think that that's something we should be aware of. That one of the problems with our system, and there are lots of advantages to our system, but one of the problems with our system, as we know, is every 4 years things change. And so under President Obama, there was more interest. In fact, he worked hand in hand with Xi Jinping. And together, they made the Paris climate talks a success. And we can get into that. We probably won't have time, but you're welcome to ask me afterwards. In China, it doesn't matter it's now part of the party policy. And of course, you can give different emphasis to it, but I think we can assume that any party leader is going to continue along these lines because it is the policy of the party.
There is security in that the next guy is not going to come and undo what you did.
Right, exactly. Which of course is precisely what's happened under Trump, where you had Obama making taking these steps to deal with climate change, to deal with the environment, and to work internationally. Now, if I understand your question, how I think you're asking perhaps how you get China in the U.S.
In June of 2008, House Republicans, and this is during the Trump administration, attacked an American NGO for working with China. And it seemed very political to me, but how do we depoliticize that? How do we let America first take a backseat to clean air and water?
Well, if America's first is about America first, we need to deal with climate change. It's that simple. We can talk about the economy, we can talk about, oh, we've got to rebuild fossil fuels, but as I say, we rebuild fossil fuels, they're building green energy. Which side do you want to be on? I want to be on the new energy side come 2030, 40, 50. But I think I want to make this point because I think it's important. In the U.S., we are talking now about a Green New Deal. And the Democrats, they differ on what they mean, but there seems to be this general embrace of a Green New Deal, of this sort of new attitude toward environment and climate change. What's remarkable, and again, for any of you interested in the environment, I invite you to take a look at this document. In 2015, the government issued a document on the development of ecological civilization.
The Chinese government.
The Chinese document. And you can get it in a translated version. You read the two side by side, you can hardly tell the difference. They're all about cleaning up, pollution, green energy, green vehicle. It's, again, the commonality is really just something to behold. Now, what's my point here? My point here is that these two countries right now are at a point where if you have a candidate who embraces the Green New Deal becoming president, maybe that person can work hand in hand with the Chinese president because this ecological civilization vision is very similar. So the answer I have, and it's not satisfactory necessarily, is when I vote these days, I don't just vote for people I think are going to help clean up the environment. I also vote for people I think are going to figure out the way President Obama did is in 2014, is how to work with a China where there are high tensions, as there were in 2014 over the South China Seas, over cybersecurity, over intellectual property theft, and he still was able to bring Xi to Washington. Xi brought him back to Beijing. Actually, it worked in reverse. And the two of them were able, on climate change, to reach an agreement because it was in both of their interests. You don't have to agree on everything else. In fact, climate change can become the common ground over which they can talk about other issues, whether it's South China Seas, coronavirus, whatever it might be. So you asked what can we do? I think we really need to use politics and vote in people who not only care about the environment along with other things, but aren't so quick to want to demonize China. And that's unfortunately certainly where Trump is at, and that's why I worry most about the next election. We can't afford to be demonizing China.
And the last question is something you have written a lot about in your book, and it's something you could probably write another book on.
Yeah.
Is what do you think are the main challenges facing China as it attempts to go into the 21st century, where it's being demonized by major trade partners like the United States, a lot of the rest of the Western world, as it tries to build an ecological society?
Yeah, so I've made the point that I think China is really determined to deal with the environment. And I've painted, I hope a reasonably objective picture, but I've also been hopeful about some of their policies. But I think we also have to be sober about the challenges. And I'll list them and just a brief sentence or two about each. I think I mentioned the first challenge. The economy is really important in China. It is the pillar of the party's legitimacy. The bargain with the Chinese people has been, with the party, has been, we'll give you economic growth, but then you need to sort of comply with the will of the party. And that's been the deal. And the party has provided economic growth. Again, 10% until these days. Now it's weakening, which means that every time, and I think we can point to the recent trade war, when Chinese economy weakens, first thing China does, I'm afraid, is it stimulates the traditional industries, the polluting industries. That's how it gets the economy going again.
It's a we'll stick with what we know for sure works kind of mentality.
Steel, cement, coal. So that's one problem, this sort of need to continue growing the economy. Another is climate change. Does he want to stand? Because I'm...
No, thank you. I'm accumulating a lot of notes.
Okay,
here.
now another's climate change. Think about climate change. Think what's happening. I mean, I don't have a map, but the Himalayas, the third pole, you have all the glaciers. Glacier provides all the water for China, a lot of the water. It's the headwaters of the Yangtze River and the Yellow River, the two main river systems. When those glaciers melt, what's going to happen to water? We're going to have water scarcity. What's going to happen to agriculture?
Right. I mean, cities like Beijing, for example, are already experiencing desertification. Every year, the winds blow the Gobi Desert a few meters closer to Beijing.
In fact, so close that occasionally the government in China talks about moving the capital. We have to move it out of Beijing because the Gobi's invading. It's that close. I mean, 25% of China is desertified, and this is climate change. So we have climate change, we have urbanization. Chinese are talking about moving 250 million additional people into cities by 2025. That's almost the population of the US. They're going to move them from rural areas. Why? Because they want the urbanites to consume. Why? Because they don't want to be basing their economy on the export of these cheap goods that we're all buying but are polluting the air in China.
They want the population to be the stimulus package.
Right. So what do? They say, we're moving them to the city. They'll get better jobs in the city, better education in the city, and they'll consume more. I don't know about you, I find this a hard thing to reconcile. You want them to consume more, which makes sense, but you also want to rein in pollution. You want to rein in waste. You want to rein in energy use. You want to rein in cars. You want to rein in housing. You want to rein in energy use, if I didn't say that. How do you do that when you're promoting consumption? So those are just a few things we could go on. As you can tell, I'm always happy to go on, but I think we've probably come to an end.